Greetings, everyone! I'm the delicious and mythical GriffinMuffin. Let's start with a question. Do you think that video games are one of the best mediums for storytelling? For me, video games have evolved into being one of the most accessible and powerful mediums to tell a story. This is largely because of the agency the player has in controlling that story, be that the progression in a linear story or the choice in an open-ended one. I never really found a game that had the balance of great gameplay and great story on equal footing. The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt did come close to this dream of mine though, but the game that has now achieved that sacred unity is God of War 4. I know, I'm late to the hype train for this game. You see, I actually was going to buy the PS4 Pro edition of God of War 4, but my brain decided at the time that the World of WarCraft expansion Battle for Azeroth was the better choice.
To the depths with you!
And believe me, I feel like a fucking muppet. This game is amazing! For about a month and a half after I completed the main story, I was still playing it, and that is so rare for me to do. After completing this game, I felt compelled to express my admiration for this game, but there's glowing reviews aplenty and I didn't feel I could make an interesting video by just discussing the game as a whole. So I decided to apply my skills, as well as share my appreciation of the art of storytelling instead, and talk about the story that was told. To me, that's one of the crowning achievements of this game. I mean, they did receive an award for Outstanding Achievement in Story at the DICE Awards 2019. Therefore, I decided to break down the story and reveal the components of what comprises the powerful and intimate story presented. I want to do this also, so that not only we can understand how a video game told such an epic story, but also to explore how we can improve storytelling in video games as a whole. So here we go, everyone, a complete narrative breakdown of God of War 4. Building a world for the God of War. World building is actually a pet hobby of mine, and it's always fascinating to dive into the world building process of video games. To me, there's endpoints of world building quality: satisfactory and immersive. From my research, it seems that the writers and designers of this game went above and beyond to build a world for Kratos and Atreus to explore, therefore achieving the gold star of immersive. One thing that is one of the most interesting parts of what the creative team had to work with was Norse mythology. One thing to understand is that most of the mythological texts that detail Norse mythology are not exactly cohesive. It has been speculated that the stories from the people of early Scandinavia were passed on by oral tradition. Only some of the accounts were officially scribed during the Christianization of Scandinavia. One major piece from this period is the Prose Edda. The scarcity of original material inspired the writers to build from it rather than anchor themselves to it. A part of myth building is iteration and reprisal. The writers decided to tweak what made the physical world and the mythology distinctly Norse and build it up from there. It's almost like Norse mythology received a soft reboot. All this led to the reshaping of the Norse world and mythology to reinforce the narrative of God of War 4. For example, Thor is bloodthirsty and selfish in the God of War universe. In standard myth though, while he is still considered a brutish oaf, he is still a protector of Midgard, so it's just a matter of interpretation. These interpretational twists brought new life to the lore in my opinion, and it supports the elements of the story that God of War 4 is telling. But these twists or pivots or however you want to call them also provide a means for the writers to add new features to the characters. Freya and Frigg are now one goddess, and Freya was previously the queen of the Valkyries before she wed Odin. But there's a point to all these changes. It's to build a world that will be a perfect skeleton for the story to be woven through. Freya is regretful of her past actions as a Vanir goddess, to reflect Kratos' own mistakes, and we put her on the warpath of vengeance, much like the one Kratos was on in the previous games. These changes work perfectly to reinforce the intimate themes integrated throughout the story, and this to me is particularly interesting. In the original mythology, Tyr is not cited much in many stories. He's just been typecast as the guy that had his hand bitten off by Fenrir. In God of War 4, however, the writers have spun way more into his story. They made him this emissary between all the realms, a symbol of hope, and is antithetical to everything Odin and the other Aesir stand for. He was a good god, and having a good god, as he's often referred to as, is excellent for the story. Giving characters like Kratos moments of introspection when referenced and directly challenges Kratos' own hatred of the gods. Lore should always support the story being told, and this is a fine example of that little maxim. The world was built for the story they wanted to tell. That vision and direction is what makes the narrative of God of War 4 so polished and refined, but the world is a mere skeleton of this epic story. The themes that define a father and son. One of the most robust narrative elements in the story are the themes. The themes of the story are presented in the narrative in a well-executed manner. The authorial message isn't diluted and is constantly supported and refined as the story progresses. So let's lay out what the central themes presented in God of War 4 are. We have thematic questions like, how does a father raise a son? Are powerful people fated to become evil? Then we have more straightforward messages such as, always seek to improve yourself. Avoid relying on higher powers. Mistakes are lessons to be learned from, and well, honesty is paramount. I'm curious if you detected any other themes that I may not have mentioned. Feel free to comment below. Now then, let's discuss these thematic questions. These two themes I mentioned are something that most characters in the story are tied to in some way. Thematic questions are by far the most powerful and interesting types of authorial message in any story. The theme of, are the powerful fated to become evil, unpacks differently upon contact with different characters. This theme is central to Kratos' own character arc. The facet of this theme that Kratos embodies is one that reflects his past. For Atreus, it's regarding his future, and for Baldur, it's about his current path. Most of the characters are a part of a feedback loop when it comes to this theme, each exposing an unexplored facet of the theme. Whenever the characters enter dialogue, they drive the plot in the span of under 2 minutes and recite the thematic question from different angles. In this way, the theme doesn't feel like a rinse, wash, repeat sort of thing, but more of a way for the player to explore the theme as it goes on. The theme of how does a father raise a son is by far the most intimate theme the story presents. It could be also how does a parent or guardian raise their child, really. Again, much like the former thematic question, each character is tied to this question in some way. For the sake of context, it's best to mention how I, GriffinMuffin, am a father myself. So at certain points in the story, it raised some questions that were actually uncomfortable to think about, such as, how much should my son know of my past? And will my influence in his life actually benefit him? It's reasonable to say that I could rant on and on about how intimate and relatable the themes are in this game, but we're here to discuss why this is a good video game story. The focus of why I want to talk about the themes is how they are first introduced to the player. Within the first 2 minutes of the game, we're given the bare bones of what to expect theme-wise from these two characters. The rage and guilt Kratos carries, and Atreus' eagerness to earn his father's attention or praise. While the writing is a major contributor to this, we should also acknowledge the amazing mocap and voice acting done by Chris Judge and Sonny Soljic. Their body language sets the mise-en-scene of how guarded Kratos is and how his son feels unwanted. The player is given enough to be baited by what's happening between these two characters. We're sort of given a mystery box. The establishment of these themes could have been achieved in a similar way in any other visual media, such as film or play. However, the difference is using moments of gameplay such as the boat rides, cutscenes to resolve previously tense gameplay sections, easing the player into a sense of security, and non-cutscene dialogue to keep the feeling of agency alive in the story. Because of how we're so involved in a video game story, taking away agency can detach us from the experience. Keep us in there. Let us feel like we control this story. That is the magic we all seek in interactive storytelling. A god's character growth. I personally think that good character growth in a story is something that should be in a writer's top priority. The characters are what the audience or player usually get attached to, even if it's one they create. God of War 4 does a brilliant job of using characters in juxtaposition to create contrast. Certain character pairings are revealed to be reflections of one another, highlighting their foils and strengths. To better describe what I'm trying to say here, it's best to use an example. The part in the story when Atreus falls ill after you fight Magni and Modi, Kratos is confronted with the urgency of telling Atreus about his godhood at the risk of him dying. Initially, he's apprehensive, still believing silence on the matter is the best policy. After Freya's little spiel on how, when it comes to your child, it's not about you, Kratos realizes that this is sound advice, and he goes off to both metaphorically and literally dig up his past to save his child. In most Metroidvania-style games, the acquisition of a new weapon to unlock previous hindrances is nothing new. To me, though, the acquisition of the Blades of Chaos is not just significant for gameplay, but for character development. It's an in-game reflection of Kratos' character development to show the lengths he will go to protect his son. I think another thing I appreciated was the subtle changes in musical motifs to represent characters' growth, thanks to the musical genius of Bear McCreary. I encourage you to go back and listen to the scene where Kratos stands in the doorway of their home during the intro to when he picks up the Blades of Chaos. You'll hear that familiar 3-note motif change ever so slightly from being dark and haunting to more sonorous. and powerful. In a more narrative focus here, God of War 4 does this cool thing where it links one character's growth to another, being almost symbiotic. When Kratos comes to terms with telling Atreus of his godhood, we have Atreus then start on the path of becoming what Kratos feared since the beginning, a selfish god controlled by rage. This was a major point in the game for me when it came to catharsis, which I'll discuss later. The way that characters grow in God of War 4 is much more unpredictable than I had anticipated. It was really refreshing to see a natural ebb and flow in a character's growth, rather than a series of predictable brick-like development of the characters. A story that understands catharsis. God of War 4 understands its importance in making a story that really pulls on your emotions. It utilizes its interactivity to create catharsis. One of my favorite moments in this game is when you return to the mountain and Atreus is embracing his godlike megalomania. He becomes unresponsive to the boy button and goes off attacking whatever he wants. I was just blown away by this, and I immediately had this need to have Atreus realize the errors of his new path that he's taken. Another moment that actually affected my psyche was when you're in the light of Alfheim and you hear Atreus say,
"It should have been him. Do you hear me? Him, not you."
This line really struck an emotional chord I never knew existed. A worrying thought that was actually brought to the surface for me for days after I played the game. What if my son grows up to resent me? And to me, that's not only terrifying, but amazing. The only other time I had a video game affect my psyche was, yeah, you guessed it, The Witcher 3. I didn't want to just wax poetic about how this game hit me with the feels. I want to discuss how the catharsis is not just purgation or purification of your deep-set emotions, but that of Kratos's and Atreus's too. I'm sure many of us began to feel cathartic release from their goals being satisfied. Whenever Kratos refused to talk about his past to his son, I felt this deep-set urge just for him to just tell him, because I knew it would make him feel better. I empathize with the characters, which I guess is something you'd want in any story. In a video game though, the higher degree of immersion, well, connection to the characters, creates a more intimate experience. Chekhovs mistletoe arrow. You may have heard the term Chekhov's gun before, but if you haven't, it's basically a form of deliberate setup and payoff within a story. When the mistletoe arrow is used to repair Atreus' quiver, the player is given a setup. We know the arrow has a purpose, with player contextual knowledge of Norse mythology, how Balder in the original Norse myth is killed by a twig of mistletoe. It's funny though, I actually had a mate who hasn't read any Norse mythology, and was blown away by what the arrow did to Balder. The mistletoe arrow then wasn't really a true Chekhov's gun for him then, or was it? The quote in which Anton Chekhov first mentions the gun makes it sound like it has to be obvious to the reader, or player in this case. If someone like my mate doesn't know about the myth of Hoder, Baldur, and Loki, then there is no setup and payoff, right? Not necessarily. A Chekhov's gun shouldn't rely on player contextual knowledge. It has to be instantly recognized. It's usually an item with emotional presence or weight. In the scene where we bring Mimir's head back to Freya, she burns all of those arrows and we see her in such a distressed state we haven't seen her in up until that point. For those savvy with the mythology, we connect how Freya knows about how the arrows end the spell, and that builds up the payoff with a reminder. For those not aware of the original myth, this can serve as a way to add mystery, like what's the big deal with the mistletoe arrows? It could add intrigue and keep the player interested. In this example, the mistletoe arrow being attached to the quiver is the setup. Freya burning the arrows is the reminder, and when Balder is hurt by the arrow, we have the payoff. But why is this so important exactly? The example of the mistletoe arrow is a fine example of the efficiency of storytelling in God of War 4. How the writers didn't waste any time to tell the story they wanted to tell. Every minute in a cutscene is dense with fuel for the narrative. That is this game's achievement when it comes to story. What can the God of War teach us? While I really wanted to make a video on God of War 4 to show my appreciation of such an awesome game, I wanted to make a video that has a point. Effective storytelling in video games is something that should be, honestly, revered and treasured. We've had some gems across the last couple of decades, and I fear that in the higher end of the industry, photorealistic graphics and flashy game mechanics take the front seat more than storytelling. And look, a game with awesome graphics, in-depth mechanics, and a good sense of progression are all still valid aspects of games, don't get me wrong. But one thing that endures and enriches our day-to-day lives is storytelling. A good story and a piece of media to me is the distinction between good entertainment and a piece of art. It has a message it bestows on us. So what can we take away from this narrative breakdown to apply both as people, players, or even developers. Don't get lost in the lore. Make the lore support the story. Constantly remind the player of the game's message with thematic questions. Aim to have an ebb and flow to character growth, as opposed to simple graduated growth. Include the player in the emotional journey of the character, and be efficient with your story in a video game. And as always, dear viewer, I'm keen to know what your experience was with this game, or what your journey was with this game, or any opinions you wish to discuss. The journey to the highest peak in the 9 realms for me is something that will stay with me until the end of my days. Playing this game has really been an actual journey for me. I think the multifaceted and reflective nature of the storytelling in God of War 4 allowed me to look inward and walk away with a lesson that was mine alone. Not just a rigid statement or maxim that the game was trying to tell me, but rather said, what does being a good father mean to you? Or will you let your past haunt you? I was able to grow as a person from this game. I learned a bit about myself as a father, and through this analysis, I've taken away motes of wisdom for me as an aspiring writer. But I think we can all learn from Kratos and Atreus. We should focus on being the people we want to be. We must be better. And that is a lesson worthy of a god. Like, comment, subscribe, click, like, comment, subscribe, click the bell. Do all that lovely stuff down below. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. If you like what I do here, be sure to click that subscribe button for more. My videos range from stuff like video essays, opinion pieces, and well, anything that really strikes my fancy, really. But here on this channel, I aim to talk about the stories behind our games, be that on the tabletop, or the PC, or console. However, that's all from me. Be sure to share this video with your mates, and I'll catch you later.
There. I'm done.